There is a pair of objects in the Western Annex that are never stored together for long before some conscientious archivist, some nervous apprentice, or some fussy spirit of classification tries to separate them again. One is a merchant's balance, its beam of polished bronze still fine enough after all these years to tremble at the settling of dust. The other is a coronet, not a grand one, merely a narrow circlet of worked gold dented near the brow and darkened inside where old fire once kissed it. Place them side by side and the room begins to argue. The scales insist that weight is truth. The coronet insists that blood is continuity. The scales claim that everything can be measured if one knows the correct unit. The coronet claims that order descends through line, oath, and inheritance. Both lie, of course. Both also tell part of the truth, which is why I keep them in the same room and allow them to scandalize one another. In the long history of Faerûn, there are neighboring lands that behave less like neighbors than like rival theses. Their roads cross, their merchants bargain, their mercenaries defect, their smugglers prosper, their nobles intermarry, feud, and occasionally murder. Their priests pray under different assumptions. Their common folk endure the same storms while listening to wholly different explanations of why authority has failed them this time. Yet each realm helps define the other by opposition. Wealth learns to sneer at pedigree. Pedigree learns to borrow money from wealth and pretend not to notice the indignity. Welcome back to the Hidden Stacks. I am Irillian Cantonine, Baelnorn Law Warden, keeper of old roads, old harbours, old dynasties, and the less flattering truths prosperous nations prefer to perfume before presenting them as tradition. This is the Lich's Tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. We remain in our second season, Realms Between Ruins, the Long Age of Kingdoms. In the first season, we traced the great sweep from mythic contradiction and world-shaping antiquity through the creator races, the shattering cataclysms, the age of dragons and giants, the long flowering of elven civilization, the crown wars, the making of the drow, the founding time, dwarven ages beneath the mountains, Imaskar and its stolen peoples, Netherill's rise and annihilation, Myth Draenor's radiant gamble, the immortal persistence of factions, the time of troubles, the spell plague, the second sundering, and the precarious breathing space of the present age. We asked how Faerûn became Faerûn. This season asks who inherited it. So far, we have stood amid the rubble and refused comforting simplifications. We opened with the plain fact that later realms do not rise on empty land. They rise on earlier claims, on broken roads, on ruined wards, on dead languages, on exhausted soil, on surviving shrines, on old thefts elevated into custom, and on memories whose accuracy matters, whether the living acknowledge them or not. We looked upon the founding time and said that heirs are rarely innocent. Then we turned to Jamdath, where the disciplined mind itself became a civic instrument, and the empire of thought reshaped the Vilhon Reach. Then to Mulhorand and Unther, where divinity ceased to be merely worship and became paperwork, harvest policy, rank, temple tax, judicial language, and imperial continuity. Then to Chesenta and Chondath, where the Vilhon Reach became a basin of competing city prides, markets, militias, fleets, and inherited injuries. Then southward into Kalimshan, old beyond the vanity of many northern realms, where conquest altered regimes more easily than it altered civilization. And last time, we studied the Shun Imperium, that grave and glittering lesson in expansion as habit, in imperial competence rotting into imperial reflex. Now we come to two neighboring lands shaped by that afterlife in very different ways. Tonight we enter Amn and Tethyr, coin, blood, and noble failure. Our thesis is simple enough to state and troublesome enough to survive examination. Amn and Tethyr reveal two adjacent failures of legitimacy. In Amn, wealth acquires power faster than honor can discipline it. In Tethyr, bloodline claims authority more loudly than authority can secure peace. One realm trusts ledgers, contracts, tariffs, and the invisible theology of profit. The other leans on dynasty, landholding, heraldry, ancient precedents, and the persistent belief that the correct lineage ought, by itself, to calm the realm. Neither solution is stable, neither is entirely absurd. Both produce their own corruptions with admirable consistency. You can learn much about a people by asking which they fear more, an empty treasury or a disputed succession. Near the beginning of an age, such questions sound abstract. Near the middle of history, they sound expensive. In the lands of intrigue, they become weather. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. In a world infested with hurried structures, contradictory permissions, ornamental clutter, and long-term neglect disguised as innovation, it is a relief to recommend builders who understand that systems should still make sense after growth, stress, and years of actual use. For clear, durable, maintainable web design and development, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. A stable structure is not the enemy of beauty. It is what keeps beauty from collapsing into rubble when too many hands begin tugging at the same doorway. Let us begin then, not with court scandal or merchant boasting, though there will be plenty of both, but with geography. Always begin with the road, the harbour, the forest edge, the river crossing, the grain route, the pirate coast, the mountain pass. Men of coin and men of pedigree alike enjoy pretending that history flows from their decisions. It often flows from where caravans can turn, where ships can anchor, where tax can be extracted, and where an army must slow to cross a bridge older than the realm sending it. Amn and Tethyr occupy a band of western Faerûn, too often misremembered by northerners as merely the long way between more fashionable stories. That is a provincial error. Look west, and you have the Sea of Swords, but not the easy romantic version of it, with gulls, noble quays, and bards misdescribing sunsets. Here the sea means ports, pearl beds, private fleets, smugglers, pirates of the Nalantha Isles, convoys that must be guarded, harbour masters who become political actors whether they wish to or not, and coastlines rich enough to attract plunder but exposed enough to require constant negotiation with violence. Look inland, and you find the tradeway and its associated roads carrying grain, wool, timber, metal, wine, tools, luxuries, gossip, priests, inspectors, refugees, spies, and diseases. Northward rise the cloud peaks and the rougher uplands, whose weather can isolate, whose passes can enrich, and whose monsters remind accountants that borders do not become secure merely because a clerk has inked them. To the east lie mountains, foothills, old holds, ruined places, and the routes by which goods and armed men come down toward the coast. To the south and southeast lurk the enduring pressures of Kalimshan and older imperial patterns. To the northwest and beyond spread the wider western trade world, with Baldur's Gate, the Sword Coast, and the long chains of coastal commerce. And threaded through or beside all of this are old forests, older grudges, and the ruins of peoples who were there before the current tax code. No such region remains politically simple. Amn sits north of Tethyr. Tethyr sits between Amn and Calimshan. Both inherit roads once used by earlier powers. Both are shaped by the long shadow of Shûn. Both have rich farmlands, ports, and access to inland movement. Both contain populations more mixed, more locally specific, and more historically layered than outsiders like to admit. Both are places where local office, regional trade, noble authority, priestly witness, criminal enterprise, and private force all matter. Yet the moral self-image of each differs markedly. Amn tells itself that prosperity is proof. Tethyr tells itself that continuity is proof. When such stories become official, governance changes. The traveler in Ammon notices quickly that money is not merely present, it is interpretive. It explains social rank. It assigns seriousness. It can soften law, invite regulation, justify harshness, sanctify self-interest, and give even piety a commercial accent. This does not mean that every Amnian is greedy in the thin, theatrical sense common to bad tavern plays. It means rather that Amn, as a polity, assumes exchange is primary. Questions of state are often approached first as questions of flow. What moves, who profits, what must be stabilized, which routes must be protected, what costs can be transferred elsewhere, which nuisance may be tolerated if it keeps caravans rolling, which scruple is too expensive to indulge. Such a society can be energetic, inventive, practical, and brutally lucid. It can also become morally stunted in ways that remain invisible to those benefiting from its lucidity. Tethyr, by contrast, feels more feudal even when its cities grow wealthy and its ports bustle. Land matters. Lineage matters, old houses matter, rural loyalties matter. Titles do not merely decorate a wealthy person. They claim obligation, precedence, memory, and legal weight. This gives Tethyr a different rhythm. Its politics are less anonymous than Ammon's, more theatrical, more personal, more likely to attach grievance to bloodline and estate. It is not that commerce does not matter in Tethyr. Of course it matters. Grain still ships, carpets still sell, pearl, tea, wine, livestock, cloth, and countless lesser goods still move from field to warehouse, to dock to road. Mercenaries still arrive with their appetites, and smugglers still discover that ideals of noble order create profitable blind spots. But Tethyr's ruling imagination has long remained dynastic even when dynasties failed it. To understand why these adjacent realms produce such different political weather, we must trace them back through the afterlife of the Shûn Imperium, and beyond that, in Tethyr's case, into an older and more wounded inheritance still. This matters for our season because here, perhaps more clearly than anywhere yet save Calimshan, we see how empires do not merely fall and leave emptiness. They leave habits, administrative grooves, tax expectations, ruined capitals, roads, patterns of elite behavior, ideas about what a court should sound like, how a city should rank itself, who ought to collect what from whom, and how violence should be domesticated into law without ever being truly excluded from it. When Shûn broke, nobody began from nothing. They began from too much. Amn and Tethyr are excellent case studies in what ambitious people do with too much inherited machinery and too little shared moral settlement. Before I say more of councils and crowns, let us give Tethyr its due antiquity, because here the question of bloodline is not a cheap affectation copied from elsewhere. It is rooted in a genuinely old story, one that binds tribal leadership, elven alliance, royal memory, and later betrayal into a single long argument over what a kingdom is supposed to be. Tethyr's oldest political memory is not of a merchant charter or a counting house. It is of tribes, clans, forests, war, and unification under a king whose name remained useful long after the conditions that produced him had vanished. The land that would become Tethyr was never culturally blank. Long before later courts embroidered its history into dynastic pages, it stood within the orbit of older elven domains and older struggles. The immense forests of the region had once formed parts of Celtomere, one of the ancient elven forest realms of the West. Dragonfire, war, and deep time changed that green world, splitting it, wounding it, and leaving behind the later forests remembered under names like the Forest of Tethyr and the Wieldarth. Human tribes lived in and around these lands as subjects, allies, trespassers, clients, rivals, and inheritors, depending on the century and the storyteller. It is worth dwelling on that complexity because Tethyr's later instability cannot be understood if one imagines a simple human kingdom expanding into empty woodland. The kingdom was born in negotiation and blood with older forest peoples always present nearby. In the early centuries before Dale Reckoning, the clans of the region did not yet make a single state. They made war, alliance, migration, and survival. Then came Darom Ithal. Around the year of the Clutching Death, 212 years before DR, he unified the Tethyrian tribes and was crowned king. That simple sentence contains an extraordinary amount of political labor. Tribal confederation becoming kingship is never merely an act of battlefield dominance. It requires ritual. It requires a story of commonness that did not exist at dawn and must be made to exist by dusk. It requires persuading proud local powers that their survival is better served by a larger order than by perpetual autonomy. And it requires enemies significant enough that centralization can masquerade as prudence. The memory of Darom matters because it gave Tethyr something Amn would never seek in quite the same way. A foundational person around whom later legitimacy could cluster. Kings in trouble could look backward and say not only I rule, but I stand in a line. Nobles could fight over precedence by appealing to antiquity. Chroniclers could pretend continuity where there had actually been fracture. Priests could bless not only office, but inheritance. The very idea of Tethyr as a kingdom rather than a zone of roads, coasts, estates, and market towns gained emotional force from this deep origin. And yet even Tethyr's foundational memory was mixed from the beginning. Darom's era was not a hymn to clean-blooded isolation. The early kingdom's relationship with nearby elves mattered enormously. Tradition preserves the role of alliance with forest peoples, and the first queen, Sara'ala Ithal, was herself of mixed human and elven heritage. That is not a decorative detail. It means the earliest royal memory of Tethyr contained within itself a possibility of cultural braid rather than racial purity. One may say if one enjoys the melancholy of preventable futures, that Tethyr was given better seed than many later Tethyrians deserved. But kingdoms age. They forget the generous parts of their own origin while preserving the useful parts. They remember the crown and misplace the compromise. The next great wound came with domination by Kalimshan and later by the Shun Imperium. Tethyr did not spend the intervening centuries in serene continuity. It was conquered, absorbed, administered, and used. That history left scars, but also practice. When Prince Strom slew Amal-Shun VII in 450 DR and the Shun Imperium finally collapsed, Tethyr did not suddenly discover kingship for the first time. Rather, it reclaimed it under altered conditions. Strom founded a dynasty that linked royal authority to resistance against empire. This too is potent material. A kingdom born in unification may acquire one sort of legitimacy. A kingdom reborn through liberation acquires another. The Strom line, with its trace of elven blood and its anti-imperial aura, gave Tethyr something like post-imperial dignity. It said, "We are not merely a province abandoned by a dead empire. We are ourselves." Such stories are invaluable. They are also dangerous when later rulers believe the story will govern in their place. Dynasties followed. The Strom line endured. Then other lines. Malaran, Queens, Lions. Each succession preserved the shape of monarchy, even as the quality of rule varied. By the time the Lions dynasty took firm hold in the 10th century DR, Tethyr had a long memory of crowns, cousins, estates, regional lords, and royal expectations. It also had the usual noble diseases, grievance elevated into principle, pride preserved as policy, and the conviction among many houses that loyalty was admirable chiefly when rewarded. Here then is the first core contrast with Amn. In Tethyr, legitimacy is narrated historically. It is inherited in names, seals, marriages, land rights, and stories old enough to survive correction. In Amn, as we shall see, legitimacy is narrated practically. It is measured by whether goods arrive, tariffs are collected, and profit continues. Tethyr asks, who has the right to rule? Amn asks, who can keep trade moving? Neither answer is sufficient, but each answer shapes the habits of the state. Tethyr's society also kept this dynastic logic tied to land. The kingdom was not merely urban. It was a realm of large estates, county powers, noble houses, market towns, fishing ports, road stations, inland agriculture, and regionally distinct communities. Even later, when Daramar became capital and Zazispur remained the largest and most glittering urban presence, the kingdom could not be understood solely through one court. Dukes mattered, counts mattered, local lords mattered, forest neighbors mattered, halfling communities mattered, dwarven and gnomish voices mattered enough that in restored times the Royal Privy Council would formalize representation for groups beyond the usual noble sequence. This is not equality. Do not grow fanciful. But it does tell us something valuable. Tethyr's political body could not be reduced to a single city oligarchy because the land itself refused such simplification. That land also refused full pacification. The Wieldath remained a presence, not a backdrop. The old forest of Tethyr held elves, fae, beasts, dangers, memory, and limits on expansion. Roads mattered in relation to that forest. So did treaties. So did trespasses. So did the old resentment that could grow whenever one side believed the other had forgotten the terms under which coexistence had first been achieved. A kingdom with such a forest beside or within its political imagination can never be purely urban in spirit. There is always another sovereignty nearby, another memory, another standard by which its greed may be judged. And yet, Tethyr's later rulers often behaved as though lineage could substitute for governance, and inherited dignity could excuse structural weakness. This, my apprentice, is the great temptation of old kingdoms. If the crown is ancient enough, if the names are sonorous enough, if the banners are old enough, some begin to imagine that continuity itself does the ruling. It does not. It merely deepens the humiliation when rule fails. We shall come presently to that failure in all its bloody absurdity. But first, we must cross the border north and see how Amn grew into a very different answer to the same post-imperial question. Amen is younger in its political form and far less sentimental about that fact. This does not make it less dangerous, quite the reverse. Where Tethyr's legitimacy leans backward into memory, Amn's legitimacy leans forward into function. The realm that came to be called the Merchant's Domain, inherited territory, touched by older elven forests, Kalishite settlements, imperial administration, and the debris of Shun's collapse, but it did not anchor itself in a grand myth of sanctified blood. Instead, it made a nation out of commercial necessity and then taught itself to admire the result. That is a rarer accomplishment than romantics suppose. Merchant activity alone does not create a state. Many coasts bustle, many caravan routes teem, many ports grow rich without becoming coherent polities. To create Amn required concentration of routes, wealth, storage, enforcement, adjudication, mercantile houses, and a class of people who believed that the safest way to preserve profit was not merely to bribe states, but to become one. Azkatla, founded in the early centuries of DR and later known as the City of Coin, became the heart of this development. Even the epithet is instructive. Cities are often named for saints, conquerors, rivers, fortresses, dynasties, or landscapes. Azkatla is remembered by what passes through the hand: coin, exchange, payment, settlement, debt, motion in metal. That is not all the city is, certainly. It has temples, neighborhoods, poor quarters, markets, mansions, docks, patrols, petty thieves, scholars, gamblers, worshippers, and all the other usual furniture of urban life. But if one asks Azkatla what story it tells about itself, the answer is usually denominated. Amn came into clearer political being after the breaking of Shun, yet its most defining governmental form emerged much later, when mercantile rivalry had become dangerous enough that the wealthy preferred oligarchy to mutual ruin. In 1333 DR, amid what later chroniclers called the Great Trade War of Amn, the Council of Six formed under the influence of Thesi Selemchant. That moment deserves contemplation. Trade war is a revealing phrase. It tells us that commercial competition had ceased to be metaphorically martial and had become materially destructive. Merchant houses, families, and associated interests were bleeding one another with sufficient zeal that a stronger coordinating apparatus became desirable. Note what this means. AMN did not tame greed by moral awakening. It institutionalized greed because unregulated greed was bad for business. There is a kind of cold intelligence in that. The Council of Six was anonymous in office. That, too, is instructive. A king embodies rule publicly. A merchant oligarchy often prefers veiling. Public anonymity protects private interests, softens the personal focus of resentment, and lets families preserve influence without exposing every line of command to open political contest. It also encourages the useful fiction that the system, rather than identifiable persons, is governing. Nothing delights entrenched wealth more than appearing inevitable. The council's duties centered on trade. They maintained internal and external commerce, regulated tariffs, supervised exports and imports, and coordinated defense with each councillor holding specific portfolios. This is governance understood as flow management. Roads, caravans, harbour access, taxation, military response, market stability, and intelligence all become branches of the same tree. A king might imagine army, court, and treasury as separate dignities. Amn's rulers were likelier to see army as insurance, intelligence as risk assessment, and law as a tool to protect throughput. It is fashionable among the naive to imagine such a state as efficient in the clean, admirable sense. Efficiency, however, depends on the criterion measured. Amn was often efficient at preserving commerce. It was not necessarily efficient at justice, dignity, or mercy. Indeed, these could become tolerable inefficiencies only when they did not threaten commercial stability. Listen carefully here, because this is one of the deep structures of the realm. Amn does not abolish morality. It prices it. A city official may be devout. A merchant may be generous to temple and kin. A caravan factor may pride himself on fairness. Local elections in smaller settlements may still involve heralds, clergy, property holders, business people, and the ritual little theatre of pebble votes cast into labelled jars. Harbour masters and village lords may be chosen through recognizable civic procedures. Religion may be tolerated broadly so long as it does not interfere with commerce or governance. Halflings may rise in influence because their business skill is respected. These things are real. Amn is not a caricature in which every infant is born clutching a ledger and hissing at charity. But the realm's dominant logic continually asks whether a principle can survive contact with profitability. If yes, the principle is praised. If no, it is negotiated, delayed, delegated, or quietly sold. This creates a distinctive social atmosphere. In Amn, there are the merchant houses and influential families, dozens of them in Athkatla alone, each entwined with finance, transport, speculation, and patronage. Below and around them are consortia, guilds, shippers, caravan masters, brokers, moneylenders, scribes, guards, drovers, innkeepers, negotiators, customs readers, warehouse keepers, and all the necessary lesser functionaries who make wealth move. Standing beside these powers, never wholly outside them, are organizations like the Cowled Wizards and the Shadow Thieves. The former claim legal authority over arcane activity. The latter claim illegality while becoming too useful and too embedded to excise cleanly. In a monarchy, such rival powers are parasitic or oppositional. In Amn, they become part of the ecosystem. The Shadow Thieves understand perfectly that crime near commerce is seldom purely criminal. It is commerce with knives, protection, smuggling, quiet intimidation, intelligence brokerage, theft directed at profitable targets and away from ruinous disruptions, movement of illicit goods, laundering of coin, discreet disappearance of troublesome persons, and the maintenance of links northward and outward across the Sword Coast and beyond. These functions are parasitic only until the respectable realize how often they have benefited from them. That the Shadow Thieves' power centered around Crimmer, itself a great trade hub and caravan city, tells you all you need to know about where criminality and commerce most happily shake hands. The cowled wizards are equally revealing. Aeon does not despise magic because it is magically illiterate. It regulates magic because unlicensed arcane force is bad for predictability. When a foreign mage can hurl fire in a crowded market, or bend minds in a counting house, or teleport away with jewels, conventional commerce becomes anxious. So Amn does what commercial states do. It creates an approved institution, gives it near monopoly power, and calls the arrangement order. The cowled wizards thus become not simply guardians of law, but controllers, monitors, enforcers, and sometimes mercenary instruments of the governing elite. Again, observe the pattern. Even the realm's relationship to wizardry is transactional. Magic must either serve the system or be classified as threat. That is Amn in miniature. Money learning to rule, then learning to regulate anything that might interrupt its rule. Spend a 10-day in Athkatla, and you begin to understand how a mercantile state enters the nerves. The city is wealthy, yes. That much any fool can see from the markets, the temple complexes, the fine facades, the orderly lamps, the density of shops, the number of people who look as though they are hurrying toward payment. But wealth alone does not define the atmosphere. What defines it is the conversion of nearly every public interaction into some adjacent form of transaction. Doors open for a fee, information arrives by arrangement, favors are reckoned, fines exist where older realms might prefer ritual humiliation or corporal demonstration, and many disputes are settled not because justice has triumphed, but because someone finally decided the matter was costing too much. Warkeen's presence in the city is no accident. The goddess of trade does not merely receive worship there, she inhabits civic mood. One feels that coin is not simply counted in Athkatla, but morally interpreted. A profitable person is assumed by many to have demonstrated competence. A poor one may be pitied in temple rhetoric and exploited by noon. This creates a harsh but dynamic environment for social climbing. In a blood-heavy kingdom, a low-born genius may remain low-born, however brilliantly he calculates. In Athkatla, wealth can purchase entry into circles pedigree alone would once have guarded. Not complete acceptance, mind you. Money rarely erases contempt. It simply makes contempt more polite. The result is a society restless with aspiration. Apprentices want to become factors. Factors want to become house partners. Petty brokers want city contracts. Caravan guards hope to establish security firms. Innkeepers dream of warehouse shares. Smugglers hope to launder themselves into respectability. Respectable people hope to use smugglers without becoming dependent on them. Foreign merchants arrive wary and leave either enriched, broken, or morally adjusted. Adventurers, especially those carrying portable loot or unusual expertise, are not an anomaly in such a city. They are a class of suppliers. Look also at Crimmer, that walled city east of Athkatla, city of caravans and open center of shadow thief activity. There, the landward arteries of Amn reveal themselves more nakedly than in the capital's polished self-presentation. Goods arrive dusty, guarded, counted, reloaded, bargained over, redirected. Teamsters curse, drovers sleep badly. Armed escorts inspect harness, wheel, bowstring, and rumor. Every caravan embodies credit, risk, and delayed appetite. Every warehouse is a frozen argument about future price. The city's criminal life is not incidental to this process. It is entangled with it. Theft, insurance, intimidation, black market substitution, debt pressure, protection, information leakage, and contraband routing all cluster around concentrated movement of goods. Crimor is therefore a superb lens on Amn's central truth. Where wealth flows heavily, informal power builds channels of its own. Then there is Moran, the major seaport and the coastward face of Amnian ambition. Ports teach a sharper version of merchant logic than inland markets do. A caravan delayed is aggravating. A ship lost is catastrophic. At sea, weather, pirates, reefs, mutiny, foreign tariffs, and naval competition all threaten profit. Thus, seaports produce not only merchants, but brokers of risk, convoy planners, harbour politicians, marine insurers in all but name, customs officials with long memories, and guilds furious at interruption. If a kingdom thinks first of territory, a port city oligarchy thinks first of continuity of arrival. Muran, Athkatla, and the lesser harbour settlements all helped make Amn outward-facing in a way many land-rich feudal realms are not. No wonder the realm learned appetite for colonial ventures later. A state trained to see distant ports as extensions of accounting will eventually mistake foreign shores for solvable entries on a balance sheet. Yet do not let the grand perspective erase the ordinary Amnian. What is daily life like for the common labourer, farmer, clerk, or lesser proprietor in such a realm? For the farmer, Amn's pleasant climate and productive agriculture bring both blessing and burden. Surplus is possible. Surplus invites tax, purchase, coercion, and dependence on market routes. A good harvest can enrich or merely expose one to new appetites from above. For the drover or wagon-wright, the realm offers work so long as roads remain open and beasts survive. For the dockhand, the sea promises wages, but also injury, rough masters, and a life measured by unloading schedules. For the innkeeper on a trade road, prosperity depends on traffic and on surviving the attentions of bandits, smugglers, taxmen, and inspectors who all arrive hungry and all insist their need is more legitimate than the last man's. For the petty clerk, numeracy is a ladder. For the unlicensed mage, it may be a chain. Ah yes, the unlicensed mage. There is a special cruelty in Amn's treatment of uncontrolled arcane talent. In lands ruled by noble prejudice, power may be admired if properly born. In wizard realms, power may be cultivated if properly schooled. In Amn, arcane ability without institutional sanction becomes a commercial disturbance first and a human fact second. One can hear the logic plainly. If magic cannot be taxed, supervised, or folded into predictable service, it must be monitored, fined, restricted, or removed. A realm of merchants fears the unscheduled spell more than the inherited fool. The fool, at least, can be priced around. And because Amn is not merely a state but a network of competing interests, everyday politics reflects wealth's distributed structure. In smaller settlements across the lands of intrigue, offices like village lord and harbour master may be elective, with men of property, shipyard landlords, and clergy witnessing vocal votes cast by pebble into jars. This sounds almost civic in the sunny sense, until you remember who qualifies as stakeholder. Local rule is participatory, yes, but participation itself is weighted by property and investment. A poor man's voice exists, certainly. It merely echoes from farther down the hall. Such arrangements make Amn fascinating. They also make it cold. For all its prosperity, the realm does not ask first how power ought to be justified morally. It asks who can keep commerce from choking. That can produce tolerance. Religions are broadly allowed if they do not disrupt governance. Halflings earn regard because business skill translates into practical respect in a way older aristocracies might deny. Foreigners may prosper if useful. Rural and urban offices alike may show more flexibility than in rigid, blood-bound hierarchies. Yet the same structure that makes Amn adaptable also makes it willing to instrumentalize nearly anything. Faith becomes acceptable because it stabilizes communities. Wizards become acceptable when licensed. Thieves become tolerable when their depredations remain integrated with larger flows. Mercenaries become respectable when hired by the correct purse. This is why Amn can feel both new-fashioned and ancient, liberating and suffocating, open to talent and rigged at the roots. It rewards capacity, but chiefly where capacity serves accumulation. It opens doors, but often only into more elegantly furnished forms of dependence. You may already see why adventurers do well here. A realm that values results over pedigree has room for strangers with blades, spells, maps, and a tolerance for morally compromised employers. Treasure can be sold. Monsters can be cleared from roads. Discreet errands can be undertaken without public heraldry. Illicit problems can be solved for fees handsome enough to muffle scruple. And if one grows rich enough, well, in Amn, the line between bold sellsword and rising stakeholder is thinner than many kings would like to believe. Now hold that thought, because Tethyr, immediately to the south, creates adventurers for nearly the opposite reason. If Amn makes strangers profitable, Tethyr makes them necessary. The kingdom's social body is older, broader, and more wounded. It carries the ceremonial memory of monarchy, the landed pride of noble houses, the urban intrigue of old ports, the nearness of forests that never fully accepted royal command, the habits of free commoners in some places, the expectations of halfling hillsfolk, the voices of druids, the edge presence of dwarves and gnomes, and the after-image of dynasties that promised order while repeatedly failing to secure it. Tethyr therefore feels less like a machine than a chorus whose members keep forgetting the same verse at critical moments. This is not merely a matter of style, it changes administration. A feudal monarchy with free commoners has a different texture from an oligarchical nation-state. In Tethyr, lordship retains symbolic and practical power. Land conveys responsibility and exploitation together. The court must mediate noble quarrels even when it lacks the strength to master them fully. Military obligation and local levies matter in ways merchant contracts alone cannot replace. House reputation affects marriage, alliance, and succession. Rural towns look upward to counts, dukes, or the crown, even while finding practical ways around all three. Political speech is full of lineage words: ancient right, inheritance, proper blood, restored order, lawful issue, usurpation, true succession. One can almost hear the genealogists sharpening their pens. And yet the kingdom is not a museum. its cities matter enormously. Zazespur, former capital and still a great seat of wealth and intrigue, remained in many ways the glory of surrounding cultures even after political centrality shifted. Cut by the Suldaskun River and ruled by a council of lords, the city joined noble presence to commercial sophistication in the old southern style. There, carpets, woodworking, maritime trade, court patronage, foreign goods, corruption and cultural display all mingled. Darumar, by contrast, as new capital, represented a more practical center, growing, strategically placed, drawing mercenaries, monster hunters, officials, and those who wished to build rather than merely inherit. Mostone mattered because of the tradeway and its delicate relation with the nearby forest. Miratma bore obvious Kalishite influence and handled agricultural trade inland and seaward. Velen watched the coast against pirates. The kingdom's fabric was urban and rural at once. This complexity ought to have made Tethyr resilient. Instead, over time, it made Tethyr vulnerable to a very specific disease: aristocratic overconfidence. Consider the slow degeneration of the Lion's dynasty. The line ruled for centuries, but its long tenure did not mature into stable legitimacy. It curdled into expectation, faction, suspicion, and the easy assumption among many nobles that the kingdom existed chiefly as a stage upon which their precedence disputes might be acted out. One king might be just, another brutal, a third weak, a fourth manipulated, but the larger problem remained. The monarchy relied on elite cooperation it could not guarantee and often could not compel. Nobles remained too armed, too proud, too regionally embedded, and too conscious of alternate claims. Where Amn neutralized open rivalry among its wealthy by folding them into an oligarchic system, Tethyr preserved rivalry inside the prestige grammar of noble order. This matters because noble rivalry is among history's least efficient bloodlettings. Merchants may destroy one another over trade, yes, but at least they usually know what they want. Nobles fighting over honor, precedence, inheritance, insult, or rumor can waste a realm magnificently. Tethyr's dynastic record before the Great Collapse reads like an argument with patience itself. Assassinations, usurpations, disputed accessions, hunting accidents, suspicious marriages, branches of houses maneuvering to supplant one another, and the old temptation of blaming external enemies for internal weakness, all become recurring features. After the death of one king during a hunting trip in the forest of Tethyr in the 13th century DR, rumor spread that forest elves had assassinated him, and persecution of elves followed. Pause there. Observe the mechanism. A crown weakens or a ruler dies under unclear circumstances. Rather than interrogate the kingdom's own fragility, many turn upon a neighboring people already burdened by old mistrust. Such persecutions are not signs of strength. They are what frightened societies call decisiveness. This too widened the gap between Tethyr's origin story and its later practice. Remember that the kingdom's earliest royal memory included alliance and mixed heritage. Later, Tethyr did not erase that past, but it often betrayed it. The forest remained close, the Wieldath still alive with elves, fae, beasts' old paths, and the quiet authority of a non-human continuity. Yet some rulers and many lesser men preferred to imagine the forest as obstacle or suspect presence. One may hear in this the broader tragedy of many human kingdoms in the realms. They inherit frontiers born from coexistence, then act as though only conquest made them. Daily life in Tethyr therefore differs from daily life in Amn in ways subtler than the simple contrast between crown and council. A farmer in Tethyr may think first of his local lord, tax demand, road safety, bandit threat, weather, and the market in the nearest town, much like elsewhere. But he also lives within a society more saturated by the language of lordship and protection. He may resent his superiors, yet still understand them through a vocabulary older than money alone. A fisher on the coast worries about pirates and tolls, yes, but also about which noble banner can actually guarantee harbour peace. A caravan guard knows roads pass through counties where local loyalties matter. A minor noble's household lives perpetually in the theatre of rank, alliance, and reputation. A free commoner may possess rights, property, and local standing, yet still feel the weight of the aristocratic horizon above him. Even manners differ. Hospitality carries ritual force. Greetings involve both hands. Daily rhythms include customary pauses and local expectations inherited rather than calculated. This can create a warmer social texture than Amn's in certain conditions. It can also create more hypocrisy. For wealth, do not be deceived, remains central in Tethyr as well. Exports of cloth, fish, fruit, rugs, pearls, pipeweed, tea, wine, livestock, whale oil and more do not move themselves. Cities require revenue, lords require income, mercenaries require pay, noble estates require tenants, labour and trade outlets. The difference is that Tethyr's ruling ideology is reluctant to admit how dependent it is on material calculation. An Amnian merchant may behave brutally and call it prudence. A Tethyrian lord may behave just as brutally and call it duty, honour, necessity, or defence of proper order. Which lie is easier to forgive depends largely on whether one has ever stood beneath the relevant banner. This is why I called the episode Coin, Blood, and Noble Failure rather than coin versus blood. Wealth and legitimacy are not opposites here. They are unstable rivals, often bedfellows, often accomplices. Tethyr's nobles need revenue. Amn's wealthy sometimes purchase prestige. Marriages, loans, offices, tariffs, contracts, and mercenary service cross the border more easily than ideologies admit. But the dominant stories remain distinct enough to shape crisis differently. And crisis is where Tethyr reveals itself most clearly. By the mid-14th century DR, the kingdom had accumulated too many unresolved tensions for ceremony to contain them. King Alemander IV ruled harshly. The court around him was thick with suspicion. Noble resentment simmered. Lesser lords and ambitious interests watched for openings. The line of succession was tangled enough to invite calculation. And beneath all the visible human maneuvering, there lurked the older realm's truth that when a realm grows unstable, outsiders and hidden powers begin to sniff around its foundations. This is not because Faerûn is cursed with melodrama, though in fairness, it occasionally indulges in it. It is because power vacuums attract predators, always. Then came the fire at Castle Tethyr in 1347 DR. King Alemander IV, Queen Rinda, and several royal children perished when the castle burned. A royal house may survive scandal. It may survive a disputed marriage. It may even survive one assassination, if the institutions around it remain coherent. But when the court's center is suddenly incinerated and the line of rule collapses amid fear and accusation, the kingdom's bottled violences come running to the surface. The 10 black days of Elend followed. I want you to resist the temptation to hear that phrase as merely excellent naming, though it is that too. Hear it as civic disintegration. Nearly the whole royal court and a great portion of the nation's nobility died in the chaos. Assassinations, riots, vengeance killings, settling of scores long delayed by etiquette. Those who had envied a rival title now found title available if the rival's household could be erased thoroughly enough. Those who had clung to the crown as arbiter suddenly learned the crown had become another corpse. Local powers fortified themselves. Old enemies remembered each other by candlelight. Rumor acquired horseflesh and knives. This is what noble failure looks like when the costume comes off. And the failure was not merely at the top. That is too convenient a story, beloved by moralists who dislike structures because blaming a dead king is less taxing than studying a whole social order. The royal disaster exposed a wider weakness. Tethyr's legitimacy had been too concentrated in dynasty, too dependent on personal rule, too tolerant of aristocratic rivalry beneath the varnish, too unable to ensure that regional powers would subordinate grievance to common preservation when the center failed. The kingdom had mistaken duration for strength. 4 centuries of a ruling line had not solved its internal contradictions. They had concealed them. What happens to ordinary people in such a collapse? Road tolls multiply because every petty power now claims emergency rights. Banditry blossoms, sometimes by actual brigands, sometimes by dispossessed soldiers and desperate local militias with better justifications than manners. Villages fortify and pray, merchants hire more guards or stay home, grain prices become political, harbour officials sell passage, exemptions and information. Mercenaries discover demand, smugglers discover abundance. Priests become judges, storekeepers, mediators and mourners all at once. Every rumour of a surviving heir, a monster incursion, a foreign plot or a newly armed count can reshape a district's entire season. In such times, even geography changes character. The Wealdeth is no longer merely the old forest at the edge of royal concern. It becomes refuge, threat, contested resource, and strategic barrier. Zazespur is no longer merely the grand port and former capital. It becomes prize and battleground. Daramar, Ithmong in its older name, becomes more valuable precisely because centrality matters when roads are unsafe elsewhere. Coastal towns glance anxiously toward the Nilantha pirates, who care nothing for dynastic subtlety and everything for cargo exposed by political distraction. County keeps become local capitals in all but name. A bridge toll is no longer a nuisance, but a declaration of sovereignty. This is why interregna are so revealing. They strip polite theory from political life. In stable times, nobles proclaim they exist to guard the realm. In an interregnum, you learn which ones were guarding their income instead. In stable times, courts speak the language of justice. In collapse, you discover how much justice depended on whether anyone could still field disciplined men by dawn. Tethyr's interregnum lasted not days, but years. Plots, riots, private wars, and competing claims stretched the kingdom toward the condition of a carcass still warm enough to attract flies. There were councils, temporary arrangements, ambitious regional actors, private ambitions cloaked in public necessity. Monsters were not absent, nor were hidden manipulators, if later traditions are to be believed, operating through the cracks and profiting from general ruin. The details vary in emphasis depending on source, and I will not manufacture certainty where the record grows self-serving. But on the central truth, the witnesses agree. Tethyr became a realm in which no one sufficiently commanded obedience to stop the bleeding. What does that do to the moral life of a society? First, it teaches improvisation. People learn which roads are actually safe, which banners mean protection and which mean extortion, which priests can be trusted with information, which inns remain neutral ground, which militia captains are merely hungry, and which local lord will burn a hamlet to deny forage to a rival. Second, it cheapens symbols. A seal is only as strong as the riders behind it. A noble title may still command deference in public, but in private, every sensible person begins asking, can this one keep bandits off the road? Third, it professionalizes violence. Mercenaries, adventuring bands, caravan guards, local free companies, and monster hunters cease to be peripheral curiosities and become central civic instruments. When the state fails, freelance competence stops being romantic and starts being infrastructure. Do you see why I said Tethyr makes strangers necessary? An adventurer entering Amn is a useful contractor. An adventurer entering an interregnum, Tethyr may be the closest thing a village has to functioning policy. This is precisely why so many later tales from the realms draw life from states like Tethyr. Where legitimacy frays and institutions fail, the space opens for charismatic, armed, mobile, semi-accountable individuals to matter. One can lament this. I often do. Yet it is one of the realm's abiding realities. Many kingdoms create heroes by negligence. Still, interregnia do not end merely because a few sword arms prove competent. They end when some new or restored legitimacy can tie force, story, and administrative habit together strongly enough that people decide obedience is again the safer, long-term bet. Tethyr, blood-soaked and humiliated, eventually found such a figure. And fittingly for our theme, that figure did not emerge from pure dynastic inevitability alone. She came in part from the adventuring class the kingdom's failures had helped produce. Enter Zaranda Star. I confess a dry amusement whenever history produces a figure who embarrasses every tidy theory at once. Zaranda does that beautifully. She was not a cloistered princess waiting in lace for fate to rediscover her. She'd been trained in wizardry for a time, took to mercenary life, fought in foreign war, purchased a county and its titles, travelled on commercial ventures, gathered an eclectic company, and moved through Tethyr's chaos with the sort of competence polite society insists is unbecoming right until it becomes indispensable. In another realm, she might have remained a remarkable captain or wealthy, eccentric countess. In Tethyr's interregnum, she became something larger because the realm had exhausted more conventional answers. This is one of those splendidly Realmsian moments in which social theory trips over practical necessity. A blood-first kingdom eventually had to be reclaimed, partly by someone whose credentials included trade, adventuring, and proven action rather than impeccable inheritance alone. Yet Tethyr could not simply become a republic of grateful mercenaries, however lively that would make the archive. It still needed dynastic continuity, symbolic repair, and a story the realm could recognize as royal rather than merely useful. Thus, Zorander's rise intertwined with that of Haedrak III, last living prince of Tethyr, long hidden under another name. Here the narrative almost grows too neat, which is perhaps why so many later tellings adorn it like a festival banner. But beneath the romance lies a profound political lesson. Restoration succeeded not through blood alone, and not through adventuring prowess alone, but through combination. Zorander brought action, charisma, force of will, and the rough competence of someone accustomed to solving problems that cannot be tabled for the next court season. Haedrak brought dynastic legitimacy, the surviving thread of the royal line, and the symbolic continuity necessary to persuade many Tethyrians that the kingdom was being restored rather than merely seized. The marriage of coin, action, and blood became statecraft. Mark that well, because it answers our episode's thesis more subtly than simple condemnation would. Wealth without honor is unstable. Bloodline without peace is futile. Yet a realm may sometimes be repaired by hybrid legitimacy, practical competence tied to inherited claim, fresh force tied to old memory, personal merit joined to recognizable continuity. Tethyr did not escape the language of monarchy. It found a way to make monarchy credible again by attaching it to someone who had actually earned obedience outside pure inheritance. The Reclamation Wars and the years around them reveal just how difficult that process was. Restoring a realm after interregnum is not a matter of placing a crown upon the correct head and expecting roads to mend themselves. Rival nobles must be subdued or reconciled. Local militias must be coordinated or dismissed. Banditry must be punished consistently enough that the punishment itself is believed. Trade must resume. Taxes must be asked for in a tone that implies future benefit rather than immediate insult. Symbolic centers must be stabilized. Loyal officers must be placed where loyalty is useful rather than merely ceremonial. Priests must be assured. Cities must be coaxed into alignment. Forest diplomacy must be handled with more intelligence than the previous generation often displayed. And all of this must happen while enemies test the new order for weakness. Zorander and Haedrak's restoration matters because it shows the kingdom attempting to learn from its own failure, at least for a time. Daromar rose in importance as practical capital, centrally placed and more suited to a restored, road-conscious monarchy than the old grand but unruly Zazespur. The Royal Privy Council's broader composition, including voices tied to halflings, forest, dwarves and gnomes, suggested an awareness that Tethyr could not be governed successfully as a closed, noble club. Knightly orders and standing forces mattered. Sheriffs and local offices mattered. Even the symbolism of restored crown and scepter, however enchanted or glorified by later retellings, mattered because a battered people needed visible assurance that rule had resumed. Yet do not sentimentalize this restoration. Tethyr after reclamation did not become utopia. It became governable. There is a great difference. Mercenaries still crowded the capital. Monster hunters still found profitable work. Local corruption did not evaporate because a better queen had mounted the throne. Roads still needed guarding. Nobles still had ambitions. The forest was still there, glorious and prickly and unwilling to flatten itself into a decorative border. But a functioning crown again connected force to law strongly enough that ordinary life could begin rebuilding around expectation instead of sheer improvisation. That is an enormous achievement, and perhaps the highest praise one can give a restored monarchy in Faerûn. Not that it became pure, but that it became predictably usable. The ordinary Tethyrian felt that restoration in small ways first. A caravan reaches town on the day expected. A toll is collected once, not by 3 separate men claiming emergency authority. A local bandit lord vanishes because royal troops actually rode out. A sheriff's writ is backed by more than optimism. A market resumes under guarded peace. A village knows whom to petition. A count learns that defiance may now be answered by coordinated action rather than neighboring shrugs. Such experiences do more to restore belief than any coronation speech. Legitimacy is theatrical at the center, but logistical at the edge. And still, the old weakness lingered in altered form. Because even a restored Tethyr remained a realm where noble precedents, landed interest, and questions of honor could never be entirely severed from governance. The crown might be stronger, it could not stop being feudal, which is to say, it could not stop relying on people who loved dignity more than efficiency. This again is where Amin differs so strikingly. Amin would sooner replace a malfunctioning dignitary with a more useful investor. Tethyr must consider what insult the replacement conveys to bloodline, precedent, allied houses, and the kingdom's own story about itself. Can you see now why these 2 neighboring realms make such rich counterparts? Each solves problems the other mishandles. Each creates corruptions the other recognizes dimly and then reproduces in another form. Each leaks into the other's life through trade, marriage, smuggling, mercenary contracts, border politics, and shared regional weather. And each, by failing differently, teaches us why adventurers flourish in the Western lands. Let us place the merchant's balance and the dented coronet on the table together now, and ask what sort of world they produce between them. On one side, Amn offers concentrated wealth, tolerated ambition, practical flexibility, and a willingness to employ unofficial instruments so long as the markets keep breathing. On the other, Tethyr offers inherited forms, noble memory, territorial dignity, and a social imagination that still believes the realm ought to mean something more than aggregate profit. Neither is wholly wrong. That is what makes the border so instructive. A realm of pure coin tends to commodify obligations that ought not be reducible to fee. Protection becomes a menu of fees. Law becomes negotiable by those with better advocates. Magic becomes licensable interference. Religion becomes acceptable so long as it does not obstruct throughput. Crime, if integrated cleverly enough, becomes informal enforcement. The benefits are obvious. Such a realm can absorb talent. It can respond nimbly. It can recover from local shocks by redirecting flow. It can reward practical people whom hereditary orders would scorn. It can even appear open to talent, especially to those rising within it. But the cost is spiritual thinning. People begin to speak as though price were proof of worth. They forget that some things are expensive because they are abused, not because they are valuable. They excuse cruelty as efficiency. They praise adaptability while quietly demanding that the poor be the ones who adapt first. They mistake circulation for justice. A man who can pay his debts is called sound. A family ruined to preserve a shipping margin is called unfortunate. The vocabulary itself becomes an accomplice. A realm of blood and land, by contrast, preserves duties markets often erode. It remembers that rule is not merely coordination, but belonging. It can ask nobles and crown to imagine themselves as guardians of more than revenue. It can preserve local attachments, ritual obligations, and identities not fully expressible in contracts. It can give people a language of loyalty thick enough to sustain resistance against mere opportunism. A restored Tethyr under a competent crown can feel, to many subjects, more humane than a ruthlessly functional oligarchy, precisely because it admits that a kingdom is not just a market with soldiers. But the cost there is equally plain. Lineage excuses incompetence. Honor disguises appetite. Local privilege blocks reform. Bloodline becomes a veil behind which mediocrities make demands they could never justify by performance. When the crown weakens, every secondary claimant rediscovers the ancient importance of his grandmother's cousin's marriage. Noble houses praise stability while arming retainers. Ritual deference consumes energy that might better be spent securing roads and punishing actual predators. And when the symbolic center fails, a feudal realm can shatter into dozens of self-righteous fragments faster than a merchant state breaks into open price war. Thus, the adjacent failures of legitimacy. Amn proves that prosperity cannot by itself sanctify rule. Tethyr proves that antiquity cannot by itself stabilize rule. Their borderlands become laboratories in which these truths are tested continuously. Think of the mercenary. In Amn, the mercenary is often an adjunct to trade. He protects caravans, guards warehouses, enforces contracts discreetly, escorts factors, removes brigands, and serves as hired insurance in steel. His employer values him instrumentally. Payment is clear. Reputation matters because it converts into future contracts. His danger lies in becoming too useful to discard and too deniable to honor. An Amnian patron may admire courage sincerely while still calculating whether your burial can be billed as incidental expense. In Tethyr, the mercenary often enters a more fluid moral field. He may still guard caravans, yes, but he is equally likely to become entangled in local feuds, noble service, monster suppression, county politics, succession disputes, forest edge conflicts, pirate retaliation, or outright realm reclamation. Here, his employer may speak of honor, restoration, just cause, and loyalty. Sometimes these words are true, sometimes they are embroidered nonsense. Usually they are both, which is what makes Tethyr such a dangerous place for anyone who mistakes rhetoric for map. Think of the smuggler. In Amn, smuggling is frequently parallel commerce. High tariffs, controlled goods, corrupt offices, licensed monopolies, and hungry buyers guarantee its profitability. It is not truly outside the order so much as one of its unofficial organs. The correct bribe, the correct silence, the correct patron in a merchant house or criminal network, and one may thrive for years. In Tethyr, smuggling exploits disorder differently. Coastal complexity, noble toll rights, inconsistent enforcement, pirate proximity, and regional disruption create opportunities where local authority may be absent, divided, or purchasable. Yet, because legitimacy is more personalized, the smuggler there must navigate egos as well as laws. A wronged baron is less predictable than an underpaid customs clerk. Think of the minor noble or would-be gentleman. Anne offers him frustration. Wealthy though he may be, title alone carries less automatic command than in a kingdom like Tethyr. He must invest, ally with houses, understand commerce, perhaps even dirty his hands with practical matters. Some adapt and become formidable. Others brood in well-furnished resentment about the vulgarity of a society that forces pedigree to negotiate with profit. Tethyr offers him temptation. There the habits of deference may still flatter him into imagining he matters more than his actual competence justifies. He can invoke ancestral precedents, house rights, old service, court connections, and local expectation. If the crown is weak, he may become a petty sovereign in all but name. If the crown is strong, he may spend years pretending loyalty while calculating advantage. No wonder Tethyr bleeds so often from noble pores. Think, lastly, of the adventuring company. In Ammon, such a company may begin as free blades for hire, treasure sellers, caravan guards, or deniable troubleshooters. Success can turn into patronage. Patronage can become equity. Equity can become social entry. One can imagine a band of competent sellswords ending several years later as investors in shipping, favorites of a mercantile house, or irregular assets attached to the council's interests. The moral danger is absorption. The company ceases asking what is right and starts asking what pays well enough to quiet the question. In Tethyr, the same company may begin by solving local disorders the state cannot reach, escorting frightened commoners, defending a town, hunting marauders, or serving a claimant. Success there tends not toward comfortable absorption, but toward entanglement. Every good deed acquires heraldic consequences. Every alliance places one inside someone else's feud. Every rescued countess has cousins. Every saved road threatens a bandit patron. Every forest incursion awakens some older and subtler quarrel about who had leave to be there. The moral danger is not purchase, but politicization. One finds oneself, after enough righteous labor, half adopted by the very aristocratic structures one originally thought oneself above. Do you begin to grasp why these realms are such perfect engines for story? It is not merely that they are wealthy or dangerous or riddled with intrigue. Many places are. It is that they generate freelance power. They produce spaces where mobile, competent, armed individuals can matter more than the official order intends. In Ammon, this happens because wealth requires deniable instruments and rewards effective outsiders. In Tethyr, it happens because legitimacy keeps fraying and must be repaired, defended, or exploited by whoever is nearest with courage and a tolerable plan. This is also why the phrase "lands of intrigue" suits the region better than many flamboyant labels do. Intrigue is not only court scandal, it is the daily fact that formal power and effective power rarely coincide neatly. A merchant factor without title may direct more actual force than a county heir. A sheriff may preserve more order than a duke. A druid at Forest Edge may matter more than 3 scribes in the capital. A thief master in Crimmer may shape trade more decisively than a judge. A countess with adventuring companions may found a dynasty while her betters are still arguing about precedence at supper. History is sometimes generous in its ironies. There is another reason these realms deserve more attention than the usual broad-stroke histories grant them. They demonstrate with unusual clarity that states are lived from below. Grand narratives prefer kings, councils, wars, and city names because such things fit tidily upon pages. Yet Amn and Tethyr can only be understood if one listens to the lesser cadences. A halfling teamster measuring whether a border official values honesty more than a discreet gift. A local priest witnessing election pebbles fall into jars. A harbour clerk deciding which cargo is worth slowing. A forester in Tethyr wondering whether his count's men will respect the Wheeldeath's edges this season. A young mage in Athkatla hiding talent lest the wrong officials notice. A noble daughter in Tethyr discovering that her marriage prospects are less about affection than about stabilizing 3 competing claims to road revenue. A cheesemaker near Daromar calculating whether peace has lasted long enough to risk a larger herd. Such lives are not decorations on history. They are the medium in which politics either works or fails. Take religion, for instance. Eamon has no single state religion in the rigid sense. Worship is broadly tolerated so long as it does not interfere with the government. To the shallow observer, this seems broad-minded, and perhaps by comparison with more jealous states, it is. But again, ask the prior question: what does this tolerance serve? In Amn, plural worship harmonizes neatly with mercantile logic. A realm doing business with many peoples benefits from not strangling every shrine that differs from local fashion. Temples stabilize neighborhoods, bless contracts, aid the poor enough to keep disorder within acceptable bounds, and confer moral language upon commercial life. Warkeen naturally thrives. Chantier is honored where agriculture matters. Other gods find niches tied to profession, route, danger, or district. It is an ecumenism of utility. A pious merchant may be sincere. The state is sincere in a different register. Tethyr's religious texture differs. Here, the faiths most associated with duty, endurance, nobility, harvest, rightful conduct and protection carry particular weight. Chantea, Helm, Ilmater, Torm, Tyr, Siamorphe. The pattern tells its own story. This is a kingdom imagining itself through stewardship, noble responsibility, suffering, justice, and legitimacy. That the Order of the Silver Chalice, devoted to Siamorphe, could matter in the political life of the realm, says much. Siamorphe is not the goddess of balanced ledgers. She is the deity of nobility, rightly understood, of aristocratic obligation, imagined as sacred trust. You may raise one eyebrow with me at how seldom actual nobles live up to such theology, but the theology matters because it gives the kingdom a moral vocabulary beyond gain. Then there are the local offices. Both Amn and Tethyr, within the wider lands of intrigue, show us a fascinating admixture of top-heavy power and local civic practice. Smaller settlements and port townships may elect village lords, mayors, or harbour masters. Stakeholders and property owners have say, clergy witness, pebbles are cast into jars. Tampering leads to rerun. Larger cities, of course, allow local elites to dominate appointments more comfortably. Yet even this limited electoral practice reveals a regional habit. The realm cannot be run from the top alone. Trade towns, ports, way stations, and inland markets require functioning local officers. The crown or council may hold sovereignty, but daily order rests on 1,000 lesser posts. This matters because it means both realms contain, within their very structure, the seeds of improvisation. When higher authority weakens, local life does not immediately vanish. It mutates around mayors, harbour masters, clergy, guild elders, caravan captains, sheriff's deputies, landed patrons, or sometimes sheer popular necessity. In Amn, such local adaptation often bends toward commercial continuity. In Tethyr, it bends toward negotiated survival under the nearest credible authority. Different tendencies, same underlying truth. The state is thick, not thin. It is made of people whose offices become suddenly more important during crisis. Racial composition also complicates the lazy outsider's picture. Tethyr is not merely human nobles and peasant masses. Halflings form a substantial portion of the population. Elves remain present, if often in strained relation. Dwarves and gnomes are fewer, but their voices count enough in later restored governance to be given formal representation. This makes Tethyr's feudalism more interesting than the crude northern stereotype of horse lords and dirt farmers. It is a negotiated monarchy over varied peoples and old local identities. Aemon, too, is not simply human greed made geographic. Halflings command respect there, in part because their business skill is recognized, and their communal methods contrast intriguingly with the stricter hierarchical habits of many human trading houses. A realm that respects halflings more for their commercial gifts than for sentimental notions of pastoral charm reveals something bracingly honest about itself. There is also the matter of architecture and civic tone. Amn's urban spaces often announce control. Walls, guarded markets, warehouse districts, fortified council structures, regulated arcane presence, lamps kept lit, because activity after dark remains profitable. Even pleasure is infrastructural. Tethyr's cities, particularly Zazespur and the older southern urban centres, carry more of that layered courtly and coastal grandeur inherited through long southern contact. River-split streets, noble quarters, harbour sprawl, ceremonial routes, imported styles, old estate houses, urban councils that still smell faintly of aristocratic perfume even when they're being bullied by practical necessity. Daramar, as newer capital, feels comparatively deliberate, even remedial, like a kingdom trying to build itself into coherence after discovering how badly pageantry had served it. And of course, both realms are haunted by neighbours. Amn looks north and west, toward broader trade, toward the Sword Coast, toward every opportunity that can be commodified. It looks south toward Kalimshan, with the wary awareness of old wealth and old rivalry. Tethyr looks north at Amn's relentless coin, south at Kalimshan's gravity, west at pirate-infested seas, inward at its own forests and counties, and backward at its dead dynasties. Neither gets to be provincial. Their politics are regional, whether they like it or not. This, too, helps explain why the Western lands generate so many stories of intrigue. No single level of analysis is ever enough. A quarrel over toll rights may implicate a count, a merchant house, a pirate syndicate, a druid circle, a smuggling lane, a caravan guild, a temple loan, and the private ambitions of a second son with too many armed friends. That is not Baroque excess. That is simply what happens where roads, coasts, forests, ports, money, and old rank meet in sufficient quantity. The listener who wants neat morality will be disappointed here. The listener who wants history dense enough to bruise the hand when lifted will be better served. Let me push harder upon the idea of freelance power, because it is one of the most important gifts these realms give to the wider history of Faerûn. In healthier states, adventurers are anomalies. They exist, certainly. The realms has no shortage of restless swords, curious mages, or pious fools testing caves. But in healthier states, such people remain peripheral to governance. The law is handled by magistrates and constables. The roads are held by standing forces. Noble disputes are settled, however badly, inside institutions. Monsters remain local nuisances or military targets. Adventurers are colorful interruptions. Amn and Tethyr make them indispensable to the order. In Amn, the reason is demand. Commerce breeds problems faster than formal hierarchies care to acknowledge. A merchant house cannot publicly admit it needs someone robbed, rescued, intimidated, retrieved, escorted, exorcised, or discreetly eliminated. The council cannot formally sanction every irregular necessity. The shadow thieves cannot be asked to do everything, nor can they be trusted with every task. The cowled wizards can solve many difficulties, but their visibility and cost render them ill-suited to all occasions. Thus, the independent company, the deniable contractor, the talented outsider with no stable place in polite order, becomes indispensable. Need an abandoned ruin on a trade spur cleared because caravans keep vanishing near it? Hire strangers. Need a rival's smuggling route mapped without beginning a customs scandal? Hire strangers. Need an item recovered from a haunted estate whose title is under dispute? Hire strangers. Need proof a harbour master is diverting tariffs? Hire strangers. Then deny you ever met them if they are caught. The moral consequence is severe. Adventurers in Amn are continually invited to think of themselves as instruments without ideology. Take the contract, deliver the outcome. Do not ask whether the merchant prince funding your expedition improved grain prices by starving 3 villages first. Do not ask whether the cargo you escort ought perhaps not to arrive. Do not ask why the unlicensed wizard fled rather than register with the authorities. Competence becomes purchasable conscience. Many succumb. In Tethyr, the reason is insufficiency. The kingdom has too many edges, too much inherited disorder, too many local claims, and too much history of institutional weakness not to need irregular help. A restored crown can improve matters. It cannot be everywhere. Monster hunters flood Daramar not because monster hunting is fashionable, but because a kingdom rebuilding itself has innumerable literal and figurative beasts to clear. Mercenaries matter not only because nobles love pageantry and armor, but because roads, counties, ports, and forest margins all require force before they can support peace. An adventuring band may rescue a district not because anyone intended such people to matter, but because the nearest formal garrison is 3 days away and the nearest duke is drunk on precedent. The moral consequence there is different, but no less dangerous. Adventurers in Tethyr are invited to imagine themselves restorers, champions, rightful swords of order. Sometimes they are. Yet it is fatally easy for freelance competence to be absorbed into a claimant's mythology. You save a town. Suddenly you are someone's favored blades. You defend a road. Now you have offended every profitable predator who used it. You back the apparently just countess. 2 months later, you discover her hereditary claim rests upon a murder politely omitted from the family chapel records. You help reclaim a city from chaos. The new council thanks you and begins excluding the people who made the victory possible. The adventurer becomes not deniable instrument, as in Amn, but contested symbol. Zoranda Star remains such a compelling figure precisely because she stands at this intersection. Mercenary, wizard-trained, commercially seasoned, politically effective, then queen. Her career is less a fairy tale than a clear revelation of Tethyr's structural need. The kingdom required someone who could act outside noble paralysis and then enter legitimacy rather than merely smashing it. She is a warning and a hope together. Hope because competence can matter. Warning because no state should need that much personal heroism simply to become governable again. Amn has its own warning figures, though often less crowned and more curtained. The anonymous counselor, the Selemchant manipulator, the cowled wizard who mistakes monopoly for wisdom, the shadow thief grandmaster whose criminal network becomes infrastructural, the merchant lord whose house controls enough wagons to make famine in one district and relief in another. These are not ornamental figures at history's edge. They are products of a polity that rewards capacity untethered from public accountability. The hero arriving in Athkatla discovers quickly that the city has room for talent, yes, but often only as long as talent accepts being used. Even the architecture of adventure differs across the border. In Amn, one begins at the counting room, the market, the quay, the private villa, the sealed message, the politically impossible request disguised as a business proposition. The language is precise, the pay discussed early, the silence implied. A job leads to another because the network notices usefulness. Wealthy interests compete for effective people. That is both flattering and corrupting. In Tethyr, one begins at the petition, the roadside plea, the county summons, the endangered estate, the rumors from the Wheeldath, the pirate-broken coast, the noble feud, the half-abandoned keep with local strategic importance. The language is more emotional, more hereditary, more entangled with identity. A job leads to another because solving one wound exposes 3 older ones beneath it. That is both heroic and exhausting. These dynamics also shape the sort of villains each realm breeds. Amn's villains often believe themselves practical. They may be cruel, but seldom wastefully so. They manipulate markets, licenses, routes, debts, customs, monopolies, magical regulation, criminal channels, and deniable violence. Their arrogance lies in thinking the price is the moral answer. Tethyr's villains often believe themselves rightful. They may be equally cruel, but their cruelty is upholstered in claims of blood, honor, inheritance, insult, or restoration. Their arrogance lies in imagining ancestry absolves them of competence. Between the practical monster and the rightful monster, common folk die with little concern for philosophical nuance. And this is why these realms matter so much to the wider realms. They show, in concentrated form, how flawed states generate spaces where private actors matter massively. Factions recruit there. Temples entrench there. Mercenary companies are born there. Smugglers become institutions there. Rising adventurers find work there. Ruined empires leave useful debris there. If you wish to understand why Faerûn repeatedly produces stories not of neat crown rule, but of bands of dangerous specialists patching holes in the world's governance, spend time in Western lands like these and ask where the state runs out? The answer is, everywhere people can still make a profit or a claim before the cavalry arrives. Now, before we close the ledger and lower the coronet back into its drawer, we should ask what these realms contribute to the larger history of Faerûn beyond their own melodious corruption. First, they demonstrate that the aftermath of empire is not uniform. Shun broke, yes, but what followed was not one shared inheritance. North of the old imperial core, Amn weaponized commerce and built oligarchic coordination out of mercantile rivalry. South and east of that border, Tethyr preserved the grammar of kingship, noble landholding, and dynastic legitimacy, even as those forms repeatedly betrayed the peace they claimed to guarantee. The same imperial afterlife yielded two different political organisms. This is a lesson worth carrying through the whole season. Inheritance is never passive. Ruins are interpreted, roads are repurposed, palaces become council houses, lineages become claims, habits become laws. No realm receives the past neutrally. Second, these lands show how southern and western Faerûn resist northern simplification. Many listeners, especially those reared on the tavern route of the Sword Coast, unconsciously assume that the realm's moral and political center lies northward. In frontier keeps, temperate forests, grey stone harbours, and city alliances that speak the common tongue with a certain clipped self-importance. The south quietly mocks this assumption. Kalimshan, which we discussed last time, is older, denser, and more layered than many northern powers dream. Amn is richer in commercial sophistication than most northern lords could govern for a month without collapsing into bribery so blatant it would embarrass a pirate. Tethyr is more historically and socially complex than those who imagine it merely a troubled monarchy between better-known neighbours. These are not side regions. They are core evidence for what Faerûn actually is, a continent of overlapping civilizational tempos, not a north-centric playground dotted with exotic appendices. Third, Amn and Tethyr help explain the long durability of middle-scale politics in the realms. By middle scale, I mean the level between empire and village. Merchant houses, county powers, city councils, customs offices, criminal networks, road stations, local temples, caravan masters, harbour masters, knightly orders, druid circles, and mercenary companies. Faerûn is saturated with such institutions because so many larger states are either too fragile, too ambitious, or too morally compromised to administer daily life directly. In Amn, these middle structures become the very muscle of rule. In Tethyr, they become the connective tissue keeping the kingdom from separating at the joints. Later factions across the realms would learn from precisely these environments. An organization that can move goods, men, and information across borders will always outlast a proud idiot in a crown if the roads are good and the treasury thin. Fourth, the Western lands remind us that geography does not simply constrain politics, it educates it. Inland caravan routes train Amn to value predictability, storage, and deniable force. Pirate-threatened coasts train Tethyr toward naval vigilance, local harbour masters, and the harsh economics of escort. Forest edges train kings toward diplomacy or stupidity, depending on generation. Mountain margins foster small, hard settlements and mercenary skill. Borderlands between commercial and feudal cultures create people adept at speaking both languages and trusting neither. Where roads, coasts, rivers, and old woods converge, identity becomes plural, whether rulers like it or not. This is why the episode's theme is not merely legitimacy in the abstract. It is how legitimacy behaves under pressure from real terrain and real exchange. A noble can claim ancient right all afternoon. If the pirates burn his quay and the grain barge fails to arrive, his people will measure him differently by supper. A merchant council can praise efficiency endlessly. If it cannot keep the roads safe or restrain predation among its own clients, the ledgers become merely elegant witnesses to decline. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly for the ethos of this series, these realms expose the distance between official stories and lived truths. Amn says, "Wealth proves competence." Yet behind that sentence stand exploited laborers, silenced competitors, licensed monopolies, useful thieves, frightened mages, and all the human residue of profitable order. Tethyr says, "Blood and crown preserve the realm." Yet behind that sentence stand murdered dynasts, persecuted minorities, private feuds, paralyzed courts, armed retainers, and the need for wandering adventurers to repair what inherited authority failed to guard. Neither realm is reducible to its hypocrisy. That would be too simple and, worse, too flattering to the cynic. Hypocrisy itself proves that people remember better standards than the ones they live by. The merchant still wants to be thought honorable. The noble still wants to be seen as protective. The kingdom still wants to be believed. The council still wants to call profit prudence rather than appetite. These desires matter. They are openings through which reform, manipulation, and tragedy all pass. If you ask why these states keep returning in the wider storytelling life of Faerûn, that is your answer. They are not static realms with one gimmick apiece. They are moral furnaces. Put almost any sort of person into Amn or Tethyr and the place begins testing them. The honest merchant learns what honesty costs when rivals bribe customs. The young noble learns whether duty is more than embroidered oath. The mage learns whether license is shield or leash. The adventurer learns whether he serves coin, cause, or vanity. The priest learns how much mercy can survive inside systems built on extraction or inherited entitlement. The commoner learns which grand word will fail him first. And because these tests are rooted in institutions rather than mere scenery, the realms remain historically productive. Change one king, one council, one war, one ruined port, one trade route, one bandit confederacy, and 10 consequences bloom outward. Observe, for example, how a border shift or secession can expose the whole structure. When a place like Riatavin slips from Amnian control to Tethyrian orbit, it is not just a dot changing color on a map. It is tariffs changing hands, loyalties rearranging, smugglers recalculating, prestige wounded, roads reinterpreted, and the neighbor's weakness or ambition suddenly made intimate. Border politics in such realms are never merely military. They are commercial, symbolic, and personal all at once. Or consider how Tethyr's restored capital at Daramar, with its influx of mercenaries and monster hunters, tells you that peace after civil disorder is built partly by attracting armed skill and giving it an address. Or how Athkatla's regulated markets and licensed magic tell you that commerce, once enthroned, fears unpredictability enough to build entire institutions around containing it. Or how Crimea's centrality reveals that caravan cities are never only places where goods change wagons, they are places where information and crime also become tradable commodities. Or how the Wieldath's continued presence ensures that Tethyr can never wholly forget older sovereignties, no matter how often courtmen try. These are not minor notes. They are the music. And now, because no shelf in these archives stands alone, we should glance southward and seaward. Amn and Tethyr sit within networks reaching beyond themselves. Their merchants, ports and ambitions face not only one another and Kalimshan, but wider southern sea roads, island raiders, distant coasts, and the dangerous habit Western powers have of calling far lands opportunities before learning whose home they are. Keep that in mind, we will need it. So what then should we carry from the shelves tonight? Carry this first. A rich realm is not therefore a legitimate one. Carry this second. An ancient crown is not therefore a stabilizing one. Carry this third. When a state cannot align power with a story its people can endure, it begins outsourcing survival to whoever happens to be competent nearby. Sometimes that means merchant houses, sometimes thieves, sometimes wizard monopolies, sometimes knightly orders, sometimes forest powers, sometimes an adventuring company with mud on its boots and no intention of becoming historical until history drags it bodily onto the page. Amn and Tethyr do not merely contrast wealth and blood. They teach us how each can fail when uncoupled from responsibility. Amn shows us wealth without honor, learning to govern. Tethyr shows us bloodline without peace, insisting it still deserves obedience. Both produce opportunities, both produce cruelties, both produce mobile, freelance, deniable, necessary power, and both remind us that the places most beloved by storytellers are often the places where institutions are strong enough to matter and weak enough to need help. Ask yourself then, which form of failure would you rather live under? Would you prefer the realm where everything has a price and the system functions just well enough that your suffering may be classified as an unfortunate cost of continuity? Or the realm where banners, bloodlines and oaths speak nobly while roads fail, nobles feud, and every local crisis becomes an argument about proper inheritance? Which is easier to survive? Which is easier to serve without becoming deformed by it? Which better rewards virtue? Which more quickly purchases it? And one question more, because I do enjoy leaving the living with problems worth carrying into sleep. When an adventurer takes employment in such lands, what exactly is he preserving? Trade, justice, order, someone's profit, someone's heraldry. The possibility that ordinary people may get one more harvest without being trampled by institutions too proud or too clever to protect them properly. The answer is rarely singular. That is why the work is dangerous to the soul as well as to the body. The archive at taleofthelich.com remains open for those of you who would like timelines, notes, and associated materials arranged somewhere more polite than the average noble gallery and less corrupt than the average customs house. The site continues to grow, which is gratifying. Archives should expand by deliberate addition, not by the sudden arrival of trunks of disputed inheritance documents at midnight. I have endured enough of the latter for several unlifetimes. Merch is coming soon as well. I remain uncertain how many mortals truly require household objects commemorating merchant oligarchy, dynastic collapse, forest diplomacy, pirate pressure, and the moral hazards of hiring adventurers to compensate for state failure. Yet I have learned not to underestimate either curiosity or the decorative possibilities of historical anxiety. If such items send more minds toward the deeper shelves, I shall attempt to suffer the phenomenon with dignity. This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. For clear, durable, maintainable web design and development, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. If you require a structure that can survive expansion, competing interests, layered permissions, and the inevitable vanity of patrons and interested parties without collapsing into contradiction, choose builders who understand that stable systems are acts of long-term mercy. Realms fall for many reasons. Bad architecture should not be among them. Next time we move farther along the southern and western currents into Chult and the southern sea roads. There we will leave behind, though never entirely, the merchant houses of Amn and the dynastic wounds of Tethyr to consider another enduring era of northern and western chroniclers. The habit of treating places they can profit from, fear, or mythologize as though those places existed chiefly for outsider interpretation. Chult will not permit that mistake kindly. We will speak of jungle powers, sacred geographies, maritime routes, old cities, foreign hunger, local memory, and the violence done by maps that call a homeland wilderness merely because they do not know how to read it. Come ready to be corrected. Until then, keep your candles trimmed, your contracts annotated, your reverence under discipline, and your admiration withheld from any regime that points to either its treasury or its ancestry, and imagines the conversation thereby complete. I am Irillian Cantonina. This has been the Lich's Tale. And remember, ruin is not the same as forgetting. Forgetting is what happens when a merchant counts a kingdom as a market, a noble counts a kingdom as inheritance, and neither pauses to ask what the people along the road have been paying all along.